The wedding of Emeka and Sandra was more than a union of two souls, it was a cultural and corporate landmark in Lagos. While the event was a masterclass in elegance, the true spectacle lay in the participation of the XYZ Bank staff, led by a transformed, yet humbled, Ada Ugo. The bankers' procession, a sea of corporate blue and gold. In a rare show of solidarity, the bank's board had approved a half-day for senior management to attend the traditional rites. The sight was unprecedented. Over 200 bankers. The irony of the situation was a masterpiece of poetic justice. In the corporate hierarchy of XYZ Bank, Ada Ugo, as the executive director of financial inclusion, was technically the superior of the branch-level consultants. Protocol dictated that for a high-profile bank wedding, the immediate executive superior of the bride was required to chair the wedding organizing committee and host the traditional introduction ceremony on behalf of the bank's staff. Ada Ugo, who once lived for the spotlight, now found it to be a searing heat she couldn't endure. The protocol, the humid Lagos air felt different to Emeka today. As he stood on the balcony of his office in Lekki, looking out toward the Atlantic, he wasn't thinking about the lines of code that had built his empire. He was thinking about a Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago. The Great Divide. When Ada Ugo was promoted to regional manager at XYZ Bank, the shift was tectonic. It started with the wardrobe, designer labels that cost more than their first car. Then came the inner circle, a group of high flyers who measured worth in champagne brands and yacht sizes. The Ikoyi apartment, once filled with laughter and the smell of home-cooked Ofe Akwu, became a source of embarrassment for her. Emeka, she had said, her voice cold as marble, you're content with your little tech shop and your cargo shorts. I'm moving in circles where your lack of ambition is a liability. I need a life that matches my title. She didn't just leave, she erased him. She moved into a sprawling duplex in Victoria Island, cutting ties with their old friends and rebranding herself as the Queen of V. The silent rebuild. Emeka didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply went back to the basement. While Ada Ugo was seen at every high society gala, Emeka was architecting the future. He developed Nexus Flow, an AI-driven liquidity protocol that solved a problem global banking had struggled with for decades. Then came Zuri Pay, a micro-loan interface for market women across Africa. Silicon Valley came knocking with checks that had more zeros than Emeka had ever seen. He didn't buy a Ferrari. Instead, he established the Mama Joy Foundation, providing seed capital to 5,000 petty traders. Built a tech hub in Aba, giving kids the tools to code their way out of poverty. Retained his humility. He still ate at the same local buka, though he now owned the land it sat on. The boardroom coup. By year 5, XYZ Bank was struggling. Their legacy systems were failing, and a predatory takeover bid was looming. Ada Ugo, now a senior executive, was desperate to save her position. She spent weeks preparing for the arrival of the mystery investor, who had quietly mopped up 35% of the bank's shares on the open market. The day of the board meeting arrived. Ada Ugo sat at the head of the mahogany table in her finest power suit. When the doors opened, it wasn't a suit-and-tie billionaire who walked in. It was Emeka, wearing a simple linen shirt and a calm smile. The room went silent. Ada Ugo's pen hit the floor. Emeka, she whispered, her voice cracking. What are you doing here? I'm here to save the bank, Ada Ugo, he said, taking the seat reserved for the majority shareholder. The lesson. After the meeting, Ada Ugo cornered him in the hallway. You did all this to spite me. To show me you're richer. Emeka turned to her, his expression devoid of malice. No, Ada Ugo. I didn't do this for the money. I did this because this bank employs thousands of people like the ones I grew up with. If it fails, they lose everything. He looked at her expensive watch, then back at her eyes. You left because you thought status was a destination. But wealth is just a tool. 5 years ago, you chose a duplex in V over a home in Ikoyi. Today, I own the bank, but my greatest pride isn't this building. It's the 5,000 women whose lives changed because I chose to invest in people, not just pedestals. Emeka walked toward the elevator, leaving her in the quiet, expensive hallway. He had nothing left to prove. He wasn't just a tech guru or a majority shareholder, he was a man who had finally found the value of things that couldn't be bought. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom of the Echo Hotel was thick with a mixture of anxiety and electric anticipation. This wasn't just another annual general meeting (AGM), it was the dawn of the Emeka era at XYZ Bank. The room was packed with the heavyweights of the Nigerian financial sector, disgruntled shareholders, and the bank's entire management layer, from the branch managers flown in from Kano and Port Harcourt to the regional executives who had long enjoyed the comforts of the status quo. The entrance and the atmosphere. When Emeka entered, he didn't use the VIP side entrance. He walked through the main doors, nodding to the security guards and exchanged greetings with the junior staff. He wasn't wearing the stiff, three-piece suits favored by his predecessors. Instead, he wore a crisp, tailored navy blazer over a simple white shirt, no tie. The board members sat on the elevated dais, looking stiff and nervous. Among them sat Ada Ugo, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She had spent the morning trying to reach him through his secretary, his lawyer, and even his old mother, but the wall Emeka had built was impenetrable. The speech, the human ledger. Emeka didn't head straight for the technicals. He stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and began. For too long, this bank has measured success by the height of our marble floors and the exclusivity of our guest lists, he began, his voice amplified and steady. While we were busy decorating our offices in Victoria Island, the world moved on. We ignored the tech-savvy youth and the market women who are the true heartbeat of this economy. He laid out a radical three-pillar strategy. 1. Infrastructure overhaul. Replacing bloated legacy systems with the proprietary AI protocols he had developed, cutting transaction costs by 40%. 2. The Market Money Initiative, a mandate for every branch manager to dedicate 20% of their portfolio to micro SMEs. 3. Radical transparency, a real-time digital dashboard for shareholders to track bank performance, eliminating the smoke and mirrors of annual reports. The shareholders, who had expected a tech boy to play with toys, were stunned by his mastery of the bank's balance sheet. He didn't just talk code, he talked dividends. The denied audience. As the meeting transitioned into a lunch break, the room became a shark tank of people trying to get close to him. Ada Ugo saw her opening. She moved through the crowd with practiced elegance, her regional manager badge catching the light. Emeka, she said, reaching for his arm as he finished talking to a group of investors. We need to talk, privately, about the transition, and about us. Emeka didn't flinch. He turned to her, his gaze professional and distant. Before she could continue, his chief of staff, a sharp-eyed woman Emeka had brought from his tech firm, stepped in. I'm sorry, ma'am, the assistant said firmly. The chairman's schedule is booked to the minute. If it's a bank matter, please file a memo through the executive office. If it's personal, he isn't taking personal appointments today. Emeka, please, Ada Ugo whispered, her eyes pleading. Emeka simply checked his watch. The afternoon session starts in 10 minutes, Ada Ugo. I suggest you take your seat. He turned back to the investors without a second glance. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been demolished. The appointment, a burden of grace. The most shocking moment came during the closing session. Everyone expected the purge, the moment Emeka would fire the old guard who had looked down on him, starting with his ex-wife. Instead, Emeka stood up to announce the new leadership structure. I believe in accountability, Emeka said. And I believe in the potential of those who know this bank's flaws the best. Ada Ugo, as regional manager, you have spent years focusing on the elite. I am promoting you to Executive Director of Financial Inclusion and Rural Development. A murmur ran through the room. It was a massive promotion in title, but a grueling one in practice. You will be responsible for moving your office out of Victoria Island, Emeka continued, his voice echoing. You will be on the road 4 days a week, overseeing our expansion into the northern markets and the rural creek communities. You wanted a high status, Ada Ugo. Now, I'm giving you a status that requires you to serve the people you once ignored. He didn't sack her because he didn't need the petty satisfaction of her unemployment. He gave her more responsibility, the kind that would force her to see the world through his eyes. He didn't want her gone, he wanted her to learn the value of the people she had stepped over to reach her duplex in V. As the meeting adjourned, Emeka walked out alone, his head held high, leaving Adaugo standing in the middle of the ballroom, clutching a promotion that felt heavier than any dismissal could have been.
Sandra, I've watched you over time and you have all the qualities of wife material. Therefore, Sandra, on my knees before the world, I ask you, will you marry me? Please say yes.
The transformation of XYZ Bank wasn't just digital, it was cultural. While the boardrooms were buzzing with Emeka's new policies, the real shift was happening in the trenches. It was during an unannounced, site visit, to the very branch Adaugo used to manage, now the flagship center for the Market Money initiative, that Emeka's life took an unexpected turn. The encounter at the flagship. Emeka had gone there to see how the new micro-loan interface was performing. Amidst the morning rush, he noticed a woman standing near the customer service hub. She wasn't shouting or asserting authority, she was explaining a complex compounding interest structure to an elderly pepper seller in perfect, fluent Yoruba, simplifying the math without being patronizing. This was Dr. Sandra Okoro. She was the branch's lead consultant for development finance. Elegant in a way that didn't require labels, she wore a simple, structured shift dress and carried an aura of quiet, intellectual power. Sandra wasn't just well-read, she held a PhD from Harvard in behavioral economics. She had joined XYZ Bank not for the prestige, but because she believed Emeka's new vision was the only way to bridge the wealth gap in Nigeria. When they finally spoke later that afternoon, Emeka was floored. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking down to someone or being looked down upon. They spoke about the psychology of wealth, how dignity is the most important currency for the poor. Global tech trends. Sandra had spent time in Boston's tech corridors and understood the architecture of Emeka's apps better than his own CTO. Shared values. They both preferred the substance of a good book and a meaningful project over the vanity of the Victoria Island social scene. By any metric, intellectual depth, global exposure, and sheer grace, Sandra was in a stratosphere Adaugo hadn't even realized existed. The branch dinner, a night of revelation. 6 months later, the branch held its annual dinner at the Oriental Hotel. It was a celebratory event marking the branch's 200% growth under the new inclusive model. Adaugo was present, sitting at the high table in her capacity as executive director, looking on with a mixture of professional jealousy and lingering regret. She had spent the evening trying to catch Emeka's eye, wearing a dress that cost a fortune, hoping to remind him of the status she thought he still craved. But Emeka's eyes were elsewhere. When it was time for the chairman's toast, Emeka stood up. The room went silent. He didn't speak about profit margins or stock prices. He spoke about partnership. 5 years ago, Emeka began, his voice warm, I was told that my vision was too small and my ambition didn't match the rooms I walked into. I learned that the wrong partner will make you feel like you're drowning, but the right one will give you the air to fly. He stepped down from the podium and walked, not toward the high table where the executives sat, but toward the table where the branch staff were gathered. He stopped in front of Sandra. Sandra, he said, loud enough for the entire room, and a stunned Adaugo, to hear. You are the most brilliant mind I have ever encountered, and the kindest soul I have ever known. You don't just see the bank I've built, you see the man I am. He dropped to one knee, pulling out a ring that was modest in size but flawless in clarity, much like the woman before him. Drive. Sandra Okoro, will you do me the honor of building a future with me? Not as a CEO and a staff member, but as equals, as partners, and as family. The aftermath. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Sandra, with a radiant, tearful smile, whispered a firm, yes, into the microphone, pulling him up into a hug that signaled the end of Emeka's long, lonely climb. Adaugo sat frozen. She had spent years chasing class, only to realize that true class was sitting across the room in a woman who didn't need to shout to be heard. Sandra wasn't just her replacement, she was the upgrade Emeka had earned by staying true to himself. As the music started and the couple began their first dance, the message was clear to everyone in the room. Emeka hadn't just bought the bank, he had finally invested in a life that actually mattered. The engagement of Emeka and Sandra didn't just hurt Adaugo's pride, it dismantled her entire worldview. To her, the bank was a hierarchy based on power and image. Seeing a subordinate, even one as overqualified as Sandra, take the position she once held beside Emeka was a slight she could not stomach. Driven by a toxic cocktail of regret and envy, Ada Ugo embarked on a campaign to dismantle their union. The Whisper Campaign. Ada Ugo started with the oldest weapon in the corporate armory, gossip. She began planting seeds of doubt among the board members and the high society circles of Victoria Island. She whispered that Sandra was a corporate social climber who had used her PhD to manipulate the chairman. At hair salons and polo clubs, Ada Ugo hinted that Sandra's Harvard credentials were embellished, or that she was a plant from a rival international bank sent to facilitate a hostile takeover. She tried to frame Sandra as a cold, calculating opportunist who was only after Emeka's newly minted billions. The blackmail attempt. When the gossip failed to gain traction, largely because Sandra's work spoke for itself, Ada Ugo turned to something more sinister. She used her remaining influence in the bank's internal audit department to dig into Sandra's past. She discovered a minor clerical discrepancy from Sandra's early years working in a Boston nonprofit, a technicality involving a grant disbursement that had long been resolved. Ada Ugo doctored the documents to make it look like financial misappropriation. One evening, Ada Ugo intercepted Sandra in the bank's executive parking lot. "You think you've won, don't you?" Ada Ugo sneered, tossing a manila envelope onto the hood of Sandra's car. "One phone call to the EFCC Economic and Financial Crimes Commission with these documents, and your Harvard grace becomes a prison jumpsuit. Leave Emeka, resign from the bank, and I'll make this go away." The tech guru's counter move. What Ada Ugo had forgotten was that Emeka wasn't just a rich man, he was a tech guru. Since the moment he took over the bank, he had implemented a sophisticated, blockchain-based internal security system. Every file access, every private search by an executive, and every document print was tracked and mirrored on his private server. He had watched Ada Ugo's descent in real time. He knew about the file she had pulled before she even reached the parking lot. The next morning, Ada Ugo was summoned to the chairman's office. She walked in with a smirk, expecting to hear that Sandra had resigned. Instead, she found Emeka sitting behind his desk with a digital tablet turned toward the door. On the screen was a high-definition recording of her in the parking lot, along with a digital trail showing exactly how she had accessed and altered the blackmail documents. The final confrontation. "You're a regional manager, Ada Ugo," Emeka said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You should know that in my world, there is no such thing as a deleted file or an unwatched corner." Ada Ugo turned pale. "Emeka, I was just trying to protect you. She isn't who you think she is." "No," Emeka interrupted. "You were trying to destroy something beautiful because you couldn't stand the fact that it grew without you. You tried to blackmail a woman who spent her weekends in Boston feeding the homeless while you were busy choosing curtains for your V-duplex." He leaned forward. "I didn't fire you before because I wanted to give you a chance to redeem yourself through service. But you chose malice. I have already sent the original, unedited documents to the board, along with the footage of your attempt to extort Sandra. You won't be going to the North for your new role anymore. You'll be going to the disciplinary committee." The grace of Sandra. Just as the security guards arrived to escort Ada Ugo out, Sandra walked in. She didn't look at Ada Ugo with triumph, but with a profound, quiet pity. "Ada Ugo," Sandra said softly. "I didn't report you to Emeka. He found out on his own because he cares about the integrity of this institution. I actually asked him to be lenient." Sandra stepped closer. "You spent 5 years building a wall of status to keep people out. I spent my life building bridges to let people in. That is the difference between us. You didn't lose Emeka because of me, you lost him the day you decided that people were tools and titles were everything." Ada Ugo was led out of the building she once thought she ruled. Her friends in the lobby turned their heads away as she passed. Emeka and Sandra stood by the window, watching the Lagos skyline, two people who didn't need to play games because the irony of the situation was a masterpiece of poetic justice. In the corporate hierarchy of XYZ Bank, Ada Ugo, as the executive director of financial inclusion, was technically the superior of the branch-level consultants. Protocol dictated that for a high-profile bank wedding, the immediate executive superior of the bride was required to chair the wedding organizing committee and host the traditional introduction ceremony on behalf of the bank's staff. Ada Ugo, who once lived for the spotlight, now found it to be a searing heat she couldn't endure. The protocol trap. As the date for the wedding of the decade approached, the bank's internal communications department sent out the official memo. It was standard procedure. The executive director of the bride's division was to deliver the formal, staff toast, and coordinate the logistics for the massive traditional rites in Ori. For Adaugo, this was a nightmare. She was expected to lead the OMU procession, accompanying Sandra as the symbolic big sister of the bank. Coordinate the dowry witnessing, sitting across from Emeka's family to negotiate the symbolic rites. Give the keynote toast, publicly praising the virtues of the woman who had replaced her in Emeka's heart. Every time she saw the wedding colors, champagne gold and royal emerald, plastered on the bank's internal portal, she felt a physical pang of nausea. The woman who had left Emeka because he wasn't high status enough was now being forced by corporate duty to usher him into a marriage with a woman who surpassed her in every metric. The Great Escape attempted. Adaugo tried everything to disqualify herself. She first submitted a medical report claiming chronic vertigo that made regional travel impossible. The bank's chief medical officer, under Emeka's new rigorous standards, politely suggested a second opinion from a specialist, who found her perfectly fit. Next, she tried to schedule an emergency, international financial summit, in London for the same week as the wedding. The board of directors denied the request. The message was clear: the chairman is getting married, the bank's leadership stays grounded. Finally, she tried to delegate the task to a subordinate. However, the board secretary reminded her that for a union involving the chairman, protocol demanded an executive director. There was no shadow to hide in. The confrontation of grace. 2 weeks before the wedding, Adaugo was forced to meet with Sandra to align on the program. She entered the conference room with her head down, clutching a tablet, her usual bravado replaced by a brittle silence. "I'm here to discuss the staff gift presentation," Adaugo said, her voice tight. "I've drafted a speech. It's short. I trust that's sufficient." Sandra looked at her, not with the spite Adaugo expected, but with a calm, observant kindness. "Adaugo, you don't have to do this if it hurts you this much. I know the protocol says you must, but I can ask Emeka to waive it." The offer stung more than an insult. Adaugo snapped her head up. "I don't need your charity, Sandra. I'm a professional. I'll do my job." "It's not a job, Adaugo," Sandra replied softly. "A wedding is about family. You and Emeka were once that. If you stand there on that day with bitterness in your heart, you aren't just hurting us, you're poisoning yourself. You've spent 5 years running from who you were. Maybe this is the moment you stop running." The unlikely transformation. The week of the wedding arrived. Against all odds, Adaugo didn't fall ill or flee to the UK. She appeared in Ori, dressed in the exquisite lace chosen for the bridal party. As the staff mother, she had to lead the group of bankers to Emeka's family house. When she saw Emeka, looking regal in his traditional Isaiagu, she expected to feel the old familiar rage. Instead, seeing him look at Sandra with a devotion he had never shown her, something finally broke inside her. It wasn't her heart, it was her ego. When it came time for her to give the toast, the room went quiet. People expected a disaster or a cold, 3-sentence formality. Adaugo stood up, her hand trembling slightly as she held the microphone. "In banking, we talk a lot about assets and liabilities," she began, her voice gaining strength. "For a long time, I mistook shiny things for assets and quiet things for liabilities. I was wrong. Emeka, you are a man of rare substance. And Sandra, you are the standard of grace I never realized I should aim for. Today, I don't stand here as a boss or a disgruntled ex. I stand here as a witness to the fact that true wealth isn't what you own, but who you choose to walk beside." The silence was replaced by a roar of applause. Emeka caught her eye and gave a single, slow nod of respect. By accepting her responsibility instead of avoiding it, Adaugo hadn't just fulfilled a corporate duty, she had finally begun her own journey of redemption. She was no longer the woman who ran to Victoria Island to escape her past, she was the woman who stayed to face the truth. The wedding of Emeka and Sandra was more than a union of two souls, it was a cultural and corporate landmark in Lagos. While the event was a masterclass in elegance, the true spectacle lay in the participation of the XYZ Bank staff, led by a transformed, yet humbled, Adaugo. The bankers' procession, a sea of corporate blue and gold. In a rare show of solidarity, the bank's board had approved a half-day for senior management to attend the traditional rites. The sight was unprecedented. Over 200 bankers, from junior analysts to regional heads, arrived in a coordinated fleet of vehicles. They wore a specially commissioned *so ebi, a rich, navy blue lace with gold embroidery that matched the bank's corporate colors but was styled with traditional opulence. This, banker's block, became a focal point of the ceremony, symbolizing how Emeka had successfully fused his personal life with the institution he now led. Adaugo's role, the burden of the big sister. As the executive director and Sandra's immediate superior, Adaugo could not be a mere spectator. According to the staff wedding protocol she herself had helped write years prior, she had to lead the presentation of the corporate gift. For Adaugo, this was the ultimate test. Standing at the front of the massive delegation of bankers, she had to walk toward the elevated dais where Emeka and Sandra sat like royalty. The walk of humility. As she approached, the crowd whispered. Everyone knew the history, yet Adaugo maintained a stoic, professional grace. She didn't wear her usual, Queen of the scowl. Instead, she wore the expression of a woman who had finally accepted her place in the new order. The presentation. On behalf of the bank, Adaugo presented the couple with a symbolic golden key, representing a new housing estate the bank had financed for low-income workers, named the Emeka and Sandra Legacy Court. The public acknowledgement. When she handed the microphone to Sandra, she didn't just pass it. She leaned in and performed the traditional, small sister, greeting to the bride, a gesture of deep respect that signaled to every banker present that the internal war was over. The reception. A networking powerhouse. At the reception, the bankers didn't just sit and eat, they functioned as an extension of the hospitality team. Regional managers as ushers, high-ranking managers who once looked down on tech startups were seen personally escorting Emeka's tech billionaire friends from the Silicon Valley to their seats. The branch managers' tribute. A group of 30 branch managers from across the country performed a surprise choreographed dance, a blend of traditional moves and modern, tech, shuffling, which brought a rare, genuine laugh from Emeka. The final toast. The most poignant moment of banker participation came during the closing toast. Traditionally, the highest-ranking staff member gives the vote of thanks. Adaugo stood up once more. "We are a bank that deals in numbers," she said, looking directly at Emeka. "But today, my colleagues and I stand here to celebrate a different kind of math. We are celebrating how one man's vision added value to thousands of lives, and how one woman's brilliance multiplied that vision. As your staff, we don't just see a chairman and his wife, we see the gold standard of what partnership should be." As the bankers stood up to cheer, raising their glasses in a synchronized salute, the message was clear. They weren't just celebrating a wedding, they were celebrating the man who had taught them that the highest social status is not found in a duplex in Victoria Island, but in the respect of your peers and the love of a worthy partner. Adaugo, finished with her duties, sat back down. She didn't try to steal the spotlight. For the first time in 5 years, she was content to be part of the crowd, watching the man she had once dismissed lead his bank, and his new bride, into a future she finally understood.